Now, we're seeing tens of millions of people around the world losing their jobs, being forced to take pay cuts and having their livelihoods compromised due to the COVID-19 outbreak. The OECD says this pandemic has already had 10 times the impact of the 2008 global financial crisis on jobs around the world. And perhaps the most concerning issue here is that the impact has been very disproportionate. The OECD says low-income workers are paying the highest price during the pandemic, as they are twice as likely to stop working completely compared to their higher-income peers who have the options to work from home. Today, we discuss the impact of COVID-19 on jobs and when or if they will come back. Joining me is Dr. Larry Samuelson, Professor of Economics at Yale University, and Dr. Achim Schmilin, Senior Economist at the World Bank. Well, my first question goes to you, Professor Larry. The OECD projects that unemployment could reach nearly 10% in its member countries by the end of this year, or even as high as 12% if there is a second wave. Which economies do you think will see the most layoffs?
Good to be with you. As you mentioned, the OECD compares this recession to the Great Recession of just over a decade ago. This one has cost us jobs much more quickly. The rise in unemployment has been much quicker. It's a tempting comparison, but we need to remember that these are fundamentally different. Behind this recession is a public health crisis, the likes of which we haven't seen for a century or so. The key to getting people back to work, the key to getting economies going again, is to get the virus under control. Those economies that do a good job of controlling the infection rate are going to bounce back more quickly than those that don't. Ultimately, to get back to where we were, to get the effects of this behind us, it's going to take a vaccine so that we don't have to keep putting the brakes on our economy, keep shutting down super spreading events at one extreme, ordinary interaction in the middle, almost all interaction at the other extreme, so that we don't have to keep moving down that scale to prevent the spread of the virus. It's going to take a vaccine. In the meantime, those that do a better job at controlling that are going to see their employment come back noticeably quicker.
So it really depends on how fast economies, how fast governments are able to contain the virus and hopefully really flatten that curve. And Dr. Schmilin, which members of society do you think will suffer the most from the fallout?
First, a very good morning. Thanks for having me. I agree, unfortunately, with the OECD that it's those that are already vulnerable before the crisis that will bear the brunt of the labor market impacts. That's partly because these workers are in sectors that are most affected, but also just, as the OECD says, because of the types of work that they do. If you are in a job that requires physical presence, that requires face-to-face contact, and that's maybe not classified as an essential industry, then both during the lockdowns that we've seen, but also during the recovery with continued social distancing, for a worker, it will have grave impacts on the ability for them to work at all. And some World Bank research, for instance, shows that when we look at Europe, at various European countries and the profiles of these types of workers, these are really some of the most vulnerable ones. They're not only low paid, as you mentioned, they're also younger, they're less educated, and they're less likely to be covered by social insurance. And this last point is really an added factor that even increases their vulnerability, because a lot of countries very much rely on social insurance. So contribution-based social insurance like unemployment insurance, disability insurance, medical insurance, and the like to really mitigate some of the impacts on the workers that such a shock might cause. But for workers that are not covered by social insurance, that are informal, so to say, the impacts will really be dire.
So as you said, I mean, the impact on the already vulnerable, it just keeps getting worse and worse, doesn't it? And well, Professor Larry, we've seen thousands of jobs being lost in the aviation industry alone and of just a single country as well. What challenges do you think governments face in responding to such massive layoffs, not only in the aviation industry, but across all industries?
There are a number of other industries that, like aviation, have been particularly hard hit. Tourism, hospitality, things that involve lots of contact between people and that people can easily substitute away from have seen massive declines in activity, massive increases in unemployment. An even greater challenge for some of these industries, airlines is a good example, is we don't know whether there will be long-term effects on the way people treat air travel. It's quite conceivable that as businesses, the heart of profitability in the air travel industry, find that they can do more and more of their activity electronically, more of it remotely, that it may be a very long time before travel bounces back to what it once was, even after we get the virus under control. In the short run, there's no way to keep these industries going short of vigorous, aggressive public assistance. That's going to be a challenge for many governments because there are many sectors in this setting. In the long run, it may take structural change. Airlines may have to think about innovative ways to conduct their business in order to bring themselves back to where they were.
And Dr. Schmiller, what's your view on this? What do you think the challenges are really in governments dealing right now, dealing with massive unemployment that's being presented by this unprecedented pandemic?
I would completely agree with Professor Larry that we really need very drastic action, very vigorous action at this moment. I think we have ample research showing that a worker who's affected by a mass layoff or a worker who graduates in a recession like we see right now will on average really face the consequences in terms of lower earnings, higher likelihood of unemployment for quite a long time afterwards. So that really means there is a need to act quickly and to act decisively. Just maybe very quickly to give you a bit of a thought process for how to deal with mass layoffs. I would say that there are at least 3 stages of support and that really a phased systematic approach is needed. It starts with what we would call pre-layoff planning. So even before a layoff happens, it's important to get clarity on the extent or the type of workers that are affected, on the support that's needed, on also the regulations, the broader supporting environment that's out there. Then second, pre-layoff assistance. So again, even before an actual layoff happens, it's important to start helping workers find new jobs by linking them to job openings, by helping them assessing their skills, by counseling them on their further career. And then, of course, the main impetus is the post-layoff assistance. So that's what happens after a worker loses their job. And here we need two very important policy elements. The one is income support to really help the workers make ends meet, care for their families. And the second one is active labor market policies. So really active interventions like training, again, employment services, perhaps support for them to start up their own business so that they can get back on their feet quickly.
So they really need systematic support, not only just financial support, but growing the capacity and ability to actually be prepared for the job market once this crisis is over. Well, Professor Larry, the US unemployment rate, meanwhile, it's dropped to 11.1% in June, down from the all-time high of 14.7% in April, as many people returned to their jobs following weeks of virus-induced restrictions. But would you say it's too soon to be optimistic right now?
Absolutely. Under ordinary circumstances, we would be thrilled at a month-to-month change of 3 percentage point drop in the unemployment rate. We don't see movements of that size. But again, this is no ordinary economic episode that we're dealing with. We could recover 3 percentage points of unemployment only because we had such a massive increase in unemployment before that. We're still facing an extraordinarily high unemployment rate. On top of that, many of the people who have been called back on a part-time basis. Many of the people who are unemployed have lost their contact to their employers or their attachment to the labor force. This is all the more serious because in the United States, many of our support services, healthcare in particular, is tied to employment. So unemployment threatens not just loss of income, but loss of other support services that are critical in a time like this. So our unemployment problem is still extraordinarily daunting.
So the number has slightly dropped, but the problem really hasn't gone away. Well, Dr. Schmillen, a jobs recovery, some project that it's not expected to recover until 2021. That's according to projections by the OECD. And another recent study by Duke University projects a very similar outlook. Would you share this view?
Well, unfortunately, this is really a time where it's very, very hard to make any kind of predictions. so it's very hard to say. But overall, I'm afraid I do share the view. I mean, when we look at the World Bank and our projections for growth more broadly, we do expect 2020 to really be a very difficult year. Basically, the deepest recession the world has seen since the Second World War. We do expect a moderate recovery in growth in 2021, and hopefully this will have positive impacts on the labor market. But we do know that the labor market recovery is probably going to take more time than the longer term economic recovery. As we've seen in past recessions, even in the financial crisis, the global financial crisis about 10 years ago or 12, 13 years ago, there was a relatively strong rebound in terms of economic growth rate, but the labor market response really took quite a bit longer. And again, this really means that it's important to not just rely on the economic recovery, but also to implement some of these proactive policies that I've mentioned before. And in addition to that, I think it raises the question about some of these more structural changes that Professor Larry already alluded to. So can we build better? Can we build back better? So can we really move towards better protection for workers, better productivity for workers in the recovery?
Well, Professor Larry, you've mentioned that an economic recovery really depends on how fast the virus is put under control. But in the meantime, what does this mean for college graduates and new entrants to the job market?
Well, Dr. Schmillen has already noted that we have abundant evidence that entering the labor force in a recession is a disadvantage that lasts for a long, long time. It puts people on a career path, on an earnings growth path that shows the effect of the recession well into their lives. We can expect that to be all the more difficult this time because this recession is having a particularly disruptive effect on our educational system. It's going to be difficult for people entering the labor force. A great fear is that many of them will not enter the labor force. They will develop only a tangential attraction to the labor force. We need to work hard, we need innovative ideas, and we need, again, vigorous policy to ensure that our new entrants into the job market, that our new college graduates can find and get started on career paths that will not hamper them well into the middle of their careers.
And Dr. Schmillen, there are a lot of concerns that the pandemic will speed up the process of automation and possibly even eliminate a lot of human jobs over the stretch of the pandemic. What major changes do you expect in the job market in the wake of this pandemic?
Some of these changes you just alluded to, I think, might actually really come to happen. Even before the pandemic, we saw a change in the nature of work with, among other things, rising digitization, but also changes really, say, in the type of contract that's prevalent between employers and employees, with like really standard wage contracts being replaced by gig economy work, by dependent contractors and the like. And it seems, at least very preliminary evidence seems to suggest that some of these changes might have accelerated during the crisis, and that there might really be a permanent shift in terms of, say, consumer behavior away from retail, away from hospitality, away from some kinds of travel at the very least. And this will have very direct consequences on the type of jobs that are going to be out there and on the, in particular on the skills that are being needed. And it means, again, that there is a need for urgent policy intervention, for urgent interventions that help equip workers with the skills that will be in demand following the crisis. For instance, these are digital skills, but these are also socio-emotional skills, skills that allow workers to use digital technology and to interact with other humans, maybe not face-to-face because that's going to be harder, but through a computer and to do so remotely. Maybe one point to add here is that I'm actually still optimistic overall and heartened by the policy responses that we do have seen in many countries. The World Bank has been tracking the response on the broader social protection and labor side, and as of our last count last week, we have more than 1,000 interventions being implemented in almost every country in the world. So there's a lot that's being done, but we'll need to see how much of that is going to be permanent and how much of that is really going to be effective.
So a lot of governments are experimenting with this, how they can better protect their workers in the long run. And Professor Larry, how do you think social insurance systems will have to adjust in the age of this new normal, as we say now?
Well, Dr. Schmillen has again given me the perfect entry into this, as he noted that our labor relations are changing. We're moving from an economy where people were employees often for their entire life of single companies to an economy that's based on more transient relationships where people are entering the gig economy or people are acting as contractors. That poses a difficulty for our social insurance system because social insurance in many ways is structured around the formal employment relationships that we used to have throughout our labor market. In the United States, healthcare for most people is tied to their employment. Income support is tied to employment. As people become freer in the labor market, as they develop less permanent associations with firms, as many people become firms themselves, we need to rethink about social insurance. Much of Europe is ahead in the respect that they don't tie healthcare to employment, so that when we have a recession like this, especially a public health caused recession, when the unemployed especially need healthcare, they don't have millions and millions of unemployed people losing their healthcare. Europe is also ahead in the respect that much of their labor policy has revolved around keeping people attached to their jobs, even if they're not currently working. Whereas in the US, we are a little bit more inclined to just turn people loose in this respect. Throughout our social support system, we need to divorce these policies from employment.
Well, hopefully governments around the world, hopefully they can tackle these long-standing issues as well as emerging ones in the job market and create a system that will empower workers in the new normal. Well, that was Dr. Larry Samuelson, Professor of Economics at Yale University, and Dr. Arirang Schmillen, Senior Economist at the World Bank. Thank you both so much for joining the programme.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
And to our viewers, thank you for watching.